The autumn of 1817 came early to Robertson County, Tennessee. John Bell stood at the edge of his cornfield, watching the morning mist rise from the red river bottom land like ghostly fingers reaching toward heaven. He'd worked this soil for nigh on 20 years, built himself a decent life with his wife Lucy and their 9 children. But something felt different that October morning, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up like a dog sensing thunder. He couldn't have known that by winter's end his name would be whispered in every cabin from Nashville to the Kentucky line. Couldn't have imagined that 200 years later, folks would still be talking about what happened on his farm. All John Bell knew that morning was that his prize bull was acting mighty peculiar. The massive Hereford stood in the center of the pasture, head lowered, pawing at the ground like he was fixing to charge. But there wasn't anything there to charge at. Just empty grass and the early morning shadows. John climbed the split rail fence, his boots landing soft in the dew-wet earth. "Easy, boy," he called out, but his voice seemed to get swallowed up by the stillness. The bull's eyes rolled white, showing fear in a way John had never seen before. The animal backed away from something invisible, snorting and shaking his massive head. Then, without warning, he bolted toward the far fence line, crashing through the rails like they were matchsticks. John stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of splintering wood echo across the valley. In the distance, a mockingbird started up its morning song, cycling through the calls of a dozen other birds. But underneath that familiar sound, John could have sworn he heard something else, a low humming, like a woman singing a tune just beyond the edge of hearing. He told himself it was just his imagination, told himself that right up until he walked back toward the house and saw the tracks. They were in the soft dirt beside the well, pressed deep into the mud from the previous night's rain. At first glance they looked like dog prints, 4 toes, claw marks about the size of a large hound. But dogs don't walk on their hind legs. And dogs sure don't leave tracks that start at the well, circle the house 3 times, then just stop. Like whatever made them had simply vanished into thin air. John knelt down, studying the prints more carefully. The back ones were definitely shaped like a dog's, but the front ones looked almost like tiny human hands pressed into the earth. He'd been hunting these Tennessee hills since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, and he'd never seen tracks like these. "Papa?" John looked up to see his youngest daughter Betsy standing on the porch, her long, dark hair catching the morning light. At 12 years old, she was already showing signs of the beauty she'd grow into, the kind of beauty that made the local boys stumble over their own feet when she walked by after church on Sundays. "What you looking at down there?" she called. John stood up, brushing the dirt off his knees. "Nothing, honey, just some old coon tracks." But even as he said it, he knew he was lying. And from the way Betsy tilted her head, studying him with those sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, he suspected she knew it too. Tell us from where you're watching this video by writing in the comments so that we can know how far our videos are reaching, and do subscribe so that you keep getting regular thrilling stories that are to come next. The next few weeks passed quietly enough. John went about his usual business, tending his crops, trading with neighbors, preparing for winter. The strange tracks didn't reappear, and the bull settled back into his normal routine. John began to convince himself that whatever had happened that October morning was just one of those unexplained things that crop up from time to time in country living. Then the knocking started. It began on a Tuesday night in late November. John and Lucy were settling into bed when they heard it, a soft rapping at the front door. So quiet they almost missed it over the sound of wind in the oak trees outside their window. "You expecting somebody?" Lucy whispered. John shook his head. It was past 9 o'clock, well beyond the time when decent folks made social calls. He slipped out of bed and padded barefoot across the cold wooden floor, Lucy's worried breathing the only sound behind him. When he opened the door, there was nobody there. The porch stretched empty in the moonlight, and beyond it, the yard lay still as a graveyard. John stepped outside, his feet immediately regretting the cold wooden planks, and looked around carefully. No sign of anyone, no footprints, No disturbance in the fallen leaves that carpeted the ground around the house. Probably just a branch hitting the side of the house, he told Lucy when he came back inside. But they both knew what tree branches sounded like, and this hadn't been that. The knocking came again the next night, a little louder this time, and the night after that, louder still. By the end of the week, it sounded like someone was pounding on the door with both fists, demanding to be let in. But every time John investigated, he found nothing but empty darkness and the kind of silence that feels too quiet, like the whole world is holding its breath. The children started having trouble sleeping. 8-year-old Joel complained of bad dreams, and little Elizabeth kept asking why someone was trying to get in their house every night. Even the older boys, John Jr. and Jesse, began looking nervous when evening fell. But it was Betsy who seemed most affected by whatever was happening. She'd always been a spirited child, quick to laugh and quicker to speak her mind. But as the mysterious nighttime disturbances continued, she became withdrawn and jumpy. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, and she started flinching at sudden sounds. When Lucy asked what was wrong, Betsy just shook her head and said she wasn't sleeping well. The truth was, Betsy was seeing things. It started with shadows that moved when no one was there to cast them. Then came the feeling of being watched, even when she was alone in her room. Finally, in early December, she began seeing a figure at the edge of her vision. A tall, thin shape that seemed to flicker in and out of existence like candlelight in a draft. She didn't tell her parents about any of this. At 12 years old, she was old enough to know that seeing things that weren't there was the kind of talk that could get a person labeled as touched in the head. And besides, maybe it really was just her imagination running wild because of all the strange goings-on around the house. That changed on December 15th. Betsy was in her room getting ready for bed when she heard someone call her name. Not from downstairs where her family was gathered around the fireplace, but from right behind her. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the room was empty. Just her narrow bed, the wooden trunk at its foot, and the small mirror hanging on the far wall. In that mirror, though, she saw something that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Standing directly behind her was a woman. She was tall and gaunt, with long gray hair that hung loose around her shoulders like funeral shrouds. Her dress was old-fashioned, made of some dark material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was her eyes that made Betsy's breath catch in her throat, pale, almost colorless, and filled with a malice so pure it was like staring into the face of hate itself. Betsy wanted to scream, wanted to run, wanted to do anything but stand there frozen like a rabbit in a trap. But her body wouldn't obey her. All she could do was stare at the reflection of the woman who couldn't possibly be there. The woman's lips moved, forming words that Betsy couldn't hear, but somehow understood. "I know what you did." Then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, the woman was gone. Betsy spun around again, confirming that the room was indeed empty, before running downstairs to where her family sat by the fire. "Mama," she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to control it. "I need to tell you something." That night, as Betsy recounted what she'd seen, the Bell family learned they were dealing with something far beyond strange noises and mysterious knocking. They were being haunted by something with intelligence, something with purpose, something that seemed to know them better than they knew themselves. John listened to his daughter's story with growing unease. He'd always been a practical man, the kind who believed in hard work and honest dealing and the good Lord's providence. Ghosts and spirits were the stuff of campfire stories and old wives' tales, not something that visited God-fearing families in their own homes. But as Betsy spoke, describing the woman's appearance in detail that no 12-year-old should have been able to imagine, John felt his certainty crumbling like a dam with too much pressure behind it. "Did she say anything else?" Lucy asked, her arm wrapped protectively around Betsy's shoulders. Betsy nodded slowly. She said she knew what I did. But Mama, I don't know what she means. I haven't done anything wrong, I swear it." Lucy looked at her husband over their daughter's head, a look that said, clearer than words, "What do we do now?" John didn't have an answer. How do you fight an enemy you can't see, can't touch, can't even be sure exists? How do you protect your family from something that might just be the product of an overwrought imagination? Those questions would haunt him for the next 4 years. The entity, for lack of a better word, seemed to gain strength as winter deepened. The knocking grew louder and more insistent, sometimes continuing for hours at a time. It developed a rhythm, almost like a code, rapping out complex patterns that seemed to mock the family's helplessness. But the sounds weren't confined to the doors anymore. They came from the walls, the ceiling, the very foundation of the house. Sometimes it sounded like someone walking around in the attic, despite the fact that there was no way to access the space above their heads. Other times it seemed like someone was scratching at the wooden walls from the inside, trying to claw their way out. The family's sleep became a thing of the past. They'd lie in their beds listening to the house come alive around them with impossible sounds, footsteps where no one walked, voices whispering in rooms that should have been empty, the sound of furniture being moved, though morning would reveal everything exactly as they'd left it. Young Joel started wetting the bed, something he hadn't done since he was a toddler. Elizabeth began sleeping in her parents' room, too frightened to spend the night alone. Even the older boys, who prided themselves on their courage, began finding excuses to avoid being in the house after dark. But it was Betsy who bore the brunt of the entity's attention. She began waking up with scratches on her arms and legs, thin red lines that appeared overnight as if someone had dragged fingernails across her skin while she slept. Her hair would be tangled in ways that shouldn't have been possible, woven into complex knots that took Lucy hours to carefully work free. Sometimes Betsy would wake up to find her room rearranged, her belongings moved to different locations. Once she discovered all of her dresses hanging upside down in the wardrobe, though she was certain she'd hung them properly the night before. The worst, though, were the dreams. Every night, Betsy would find herself in the same place, a clearing in the woods behind their house, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean inward like they were listening. In the center of the clearing stood the gray woman, always watching, always waiting. In these dreams, the woman would speak, her voice carrying the sound of winter wind through bare branches. She would tell Betsy things, secrets about the family, about the neighbors, about events that hadn't happened yet, but somehow came true within days of the dreams. "Your father owes money to William Porter," the woman said one night. "More money than he can pay. Porter will come calling next week, and your daddy will have to sell the North 40 to cover his debt." 3 days later, William Porter arrived at their door, hat in hand and a ledger book under his arm. The conversation that followed played out exactly as the dream had predicted, down to the specific words used and the awkward silence that fell when John realized he had no choice but to part with some of his land. As word of the Bells' supernatural troubles spread through Robertson County, people began taking sides. Some, mostly the church-going folk who knew John as an honest man and a good neighbor, believed the family was genuinely being tormented by some kind of evil spirit. They offered prayers, holy water, and various folk remedies designed to drive away malevolent entities. Others, particularly those who'd had business disputes with John or who just enjoyed gossip for its own sake, whispered that the whole thing was some kind of elaborate hoax. They suggested that Betsy was a clever girl, putting on an act for attention, or that John himself was behind the disturbances for reasons known only to him. This second group included Joshua Gardner, a young man who'd been courting Betsy before the haunting began. Josh was handsome and well-regarded, the kind of boy that fathers approved of and mothers hoped their daughters would marry. But as the supernatural events around the Bell family intensified, Josh began pulling away. At first, he just visited less frequently. Then he started making excuses when Betsy asked him to church socials or community gatherings. Finally, in the spring of 1818, he stopped coming around altogether. When Betsy asked him directly what had changed, Josh looked uncomfortable and mumbled something about not wanting to get mixed up in all that strangeness. The implication was clear. He thought she was either lying about the supernatural occurrences or was genuinely disturbed, and either way, he wanted no part of it. The loss of Josh's companionship hit Betsy harder than she wanted to admit. She genuinely cared for him, and his rejection felt like confirmation of her worst fears, that she was somehow responsible for what was happening to her family, that she was cursed or crazy or both. The gray woman seemed to sense Betsy's despair and fed on it like a plant drawing nourishment from poisoned soil. The entity's manifestations became more personal, more targeted. It began speaking to the family directly, its voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The voice was distinctly female, with a gravelly quality that made it sound ancient and bitter. "John Bell," it would say, the words seeming to come from inside the walls themselves. "I know what you done. I know about the money. I know about the lie you told William Porter about them boundary lines." John would go white as a sheet at these pronouncements, because the entity invariably knew things it shouldn't have been able to know. Private conversations, hidden debts, small deceptions that he'd never shared with anyone. But the entity saved its cruelest words for Betsy. "Ugly little girl," it would whisper when she was alone in her room. "Think you're so pretty, but I can see what you really are. I can see the rot inside you, the darkness that makes good boys like Joshua Gardner run away." Sometimes the voice would mimic Betsy's own words back to her, repeating private thoughts she'd never spoken aloud. Other times it would sing twisted versions of hymns they'd learned in church, turning sacred words into something obscene and mocking. The psychological toll was enormous. Betsy began to withdraw even further, spending long hours staring out her bedroom window at the woods beyond their property. She stopped eating regularly, growing thin and pale. Dark circles under her eyes made her look years older than her actual age. Lucy tried everything she could think of to help her daughter. She made special meals designed to tempt Betsy's appetite. She read Bible verses aloud in the evenings, hoping the holy words would drive away whatever was tormenting their family. She even consulted with old Mrs. Henderson, a woman who was rumored to know something about dealing with unnatural problems. Mrs. Henderson came to the house on a gray March evening, carrying a cloth bag filled with various herbs and roots. She was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she had the kind of presence that made even grown men step aside when she passed. She walked through the house slowly, pausing in doorways and corners, her head tilted like she was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. In Betsy's room, she stopped completely, her weathered face growing troubled. "Child," she said to Betsy, "what did you do to bring this thing here?" "I didn't do anything," Betsy replied. But even as she said it, she felt a gnawing uncertainty in her stomach. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "Spirits like this don't just show up random-like. They got to be called, or they got to be owed something. And this one's got a powerful grudge." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small bundle of dried herbs tied with black thread. "Hang this over your bed," she told Betsy, "and if you got any idea what might have set this thing off, you better tell your folks before it gets worse." That night, as Betsy lay in bed staring at the herb bundle swaying gently from a nail in the ceiling beam, she tried to think of anything she might have done to provoke supernatural attention. But her mind kept coming back to one incident from the previous summer. She'd been walking in the woods behind their house following the path that led down to the creek, when she'd come upon a small clearing she'd never noticed before. In the center of the clearing was a ring of stones, arranged in a perfect circle about 6 feet across. Inside the circle, the grass was dead despite the summer heat, leaving only bare earth. Betsy had been curious about the stone circle. It looked like something built by people, not a natural formation. She'd stepped inside to get a better look, kneeling down to examine the stones more closely. They were covered with markings that looked almost like writing, but not in any alphabet she recognized. As she'd knelt there trying to make sense of the strange symbols, she'd heard a voice calling her name from somewhere deeper in the woods. The voice had sounded like her mother, urgent and worried, as if Betsy was in some kind of danger. She'd jumped up and run toward the voice, calling back that she was coming. But when she'd reached the edge of the woods near their house, her mother was hanging laundry on the line, calm as could be. When Betsy asked if she'd been calling her, Lucy had looked confused and said she'd been working quietly for the past hour. Betsy had returned to the clearing later that same day, but she'd never been able to find it again. The path that had led her there seemed to have vanished, and despite searching for hours, she'd found nothing but ordinary woods. Now, lying in her bed with Mrs. Henderson's herbs swaying overhead, Betsy wondered if stepping inside that stone circle had somehow opened a door that should have stayed closed. Spring turned to summer, and the haunting showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger and more malevolent with each passing week. The entity had begun physically attacking Betsy, slapping her face and pulling her hair with invisible hands. She would wake up with handprint bruises on her arms and red marks on her cheeks. The attacks always happened when she was alone, which led to more whispers from the skeptics in the community. They suggested that Betsy was inflicting the injuries on herself for attention, though none of them could explain how a 12-year-old girl could leave handprint bruises in places she couldn't reach. John Bell was at his wit's end. He'd tried everything he could think of: prayer, holy water, even hiring a traveling preacher to come and bless the house. Nothing worked. The entity seemed to mock their efforts, laughing with a sound like wind through a cemetery. In desperation, John reached out to James Johnston, a man from nearby Springfield, who had a reputation for dealing with unusual problems. Johnston was known as a conjure man, someone who understood the old ways of dealing with supernatural threats. Johnston arrived on a sweltering July evening, traveling light, with only a small bag of what he called his tools of the trade. He was a middle-aged man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to look right through a person. Unlike Mrs. Henderson, Johnston didn't ask questions about what might have caused the haunting. Instead, he set up what he called a watching in Betsy's room, arranging candles in specific patterns and burning herbs that filled the air with unfamiliar smells. As darkness fell, the family gathered in the kitchen while Johnston kept his vigil upstairs. They could hear him moving around, occasionally speaking in a low voice, though they couldn't make out the words. Around midnight, they heard Betsy scream. John rushed upstairs, taking the steps 3 at a time with Lucy and the boys right behind him. They found Johnston standing in the middle of Betsy's room, his face pale but determined, while Betsy cowered in the corner, her nightgown torn and her hair wild. "It's here," Johnston said grimly, "and it's powerful, angry." As he spoke, the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath came out in visible puffs and frost began forming on the window glass. The candles Johnston had arranged flickered violently, their flames dancing in ways that defied the still air. Then the voice came, louder and more menacing than they'd ever heard it before. "Get out," it roared, the sound seeming to come from every surface in the room at once. "This is my place now. The girl belongs to me." Johnston pulled a small leather pouch from his bag and began scattering its contents, some kind of dark powder, in a circle around Betsy. As the powder hit the floor, it seemed to sizzle and smoke, filling the room with an acrid smell. The entity's response was immediate and violent. The bed lifted off the floor and slammed back down with enough force to crack the wooden frame. The mirror on the wall shattered, sending glass shards flying in all directions. Books flew off the shelf, their pages ripping free and swirling around the room like a tornado made of paper. Through it all, Johnston continued his work, chanting words in a language none of them recognized while continuing to spread the powder. But it was clear he was fighting a losing battle. The entity's power was too strong, too deeply entrenched. Finally, with a sound like thunder, every candle in the room went out simultaneously, plunging them into absolute darkness. When John managed to light a lamp, they found Johnston unconscious on the floor, blood trickling from his nose. The conjure man left the next morning, shaking his head and refusing payment. "I'm sorry, John," he said as he prepared to ride away. "Whatever's got hold of your daughter, it's beyond my abilities. This thing has been feeding on her fear and anger for months now. It's too strong." He paused, looking back at the house with troubled eyes. "If I were you, I'd consider sending the girl away for a while. Maybe if she's not here to feed on, it'll weaken enough that someone with more skill than me can deal with it." But even as he said it, Johnston's expression suggested he didn't hold much hope for that solution. The idea of sending Betsy away was heartbreaking for Lucy, but as the attacks on their daughter intensified, it began to seem like their only option. The entity had become increasingly violent, leaving Betsy with injuries that were difficult to explain to concerned neighbors and impossible to treat with conventional medicine. The breaking point came in late August. Betsy was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to eat the breakfast her mother had prepared when the entity struck with unprecedented fury. An invisible force lifted her from her chair and threw her against the wall with enough violence to crack the wooden planks. Before anyone could react, she was dragged across the floor by her hair, screaming in pain and terror. John and his sons tried to help, but their hands passed through empty air. They could see Betsy being attacked, could hear her cries, but they were powerless to intervene. Lucy fell to her knees, praying desperately while tears streamed down her face. The attack lasted nearly 10 minutes before the entity finally released its hold. Betsy lay curled on the floor, sobbing and bleeding from numerous scratches and bruises. But the worst injury wasn't physical. It was the look in her eyes, the hollow expression of someone whose spirit had been nearly broken. That evening, John made the hardest decision of his life. He would send Betsy to stay with his brother in North Carolina, at least until they could find someone capable of dealing with their supernatural problem. The plan was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to break the entity's hold on their daughter and give her a chance to recover. But as they prepared for Betsy's departure, the gray woman appeared to her one final time. Betsy was packing her few belongings when she felt the familiar chill that announced the entity's presence. She turned slowly, already knowing what she would see. The gray woman stood by the window, but she looked different now, more solid, more real than she'd ever appeared before. Her pale eyes fixed on Betsy with an intensity that made the girl's knees weak. "You can run," the woman said, her voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. "You can hide behind your family's love and your uncle's kindness, but I will always be with you, girl. I am part of you now, woven into the very fabric of your soul." The woman stepped closer, and Betsy could smell something like grave dirt and winter wind. "Every man who tries to love you will see me in your shadow," the entity continued. "Every child you bear will carry my mark. You opened the door when you stepped into my circle, and doors once opened can never truly be closed." With those words hanging in the air like a curse, the gray woman faded away, leaving Betsy alone with the terrible certainty that her departure would only be the beginning of a much longer nightmare. The next morning, John Bell loaded his youngest daughter's trunk onto the wagon and helped her climb up beside the driver. As they prepared to leave, Betsy looked back at the house that had been both her sanctuary and her prison, wondering if she would ever be able to return. Behind one of the upstairs windows, barely visible in the morning shadows, a gray figure watched her go. The Bell Witch had claimed its prize, and like all the best curses, it was just patient enough to let its victim believe for a little while that escape might be possible. As the wagon disappeared down the dusty road toward North Carolina, carrying Betsy away from everything she'd ever known, the wind through the oak trees around the Bell farmhouse carried a sound that might have been laughter, or it might have been weeping. In the years that followed, the entity that had tormented the Bell family would become legendary throughout Tennessee and beyond. Stories would be told and retold, growing in the telling until fact and fiction became impossible to separate. But those who lived through it, who heard the knocking in the walls, who watched furniture move by itself, who saw the marks appear on an innocent girl's skin, they knew the truth was far stranger and more terrible than any story. Some doors once opened can never be closed, and some curses are patient enough to wait generations for their full power to unfold. The Bell Witch was both.